Thank you very much to all our speakers. You'll notice that I asked them to speak for as short a time as possible, and they've admirably kept to that, so that there's more time for questions. We wanted this event to be as much about your questions as possible, and as much as possible for you to come up with questions that they haven't thought of. So, in a sense, what they've done is throw lots of puzzles your way. They've not given you lots of answers. But before we get to that point in the evening, I'm just going to ask each of them one question of my own, and then it's going to be over to you. So have some time to think about some crazy questions, or good questions. Anil, I'm going to come to you first. I said at the beginning that it's only in the last few decades, really, that scientists have started to really grapple with this. People have been thinking about it for a long time, though. What's taken scientists so long to get onto it?
In a sense, actually, science has been on about consciousness for a lot longer, and in fact, the birth of psychology, which started maybe in the end of the 19th century with William James, we've heard about, and Wilhelm Wundt in Germany, the central topic for psychology at its inception was consciousness. It's the broadest fact about, it's the most simple psychological fact. We're aware of the world and of ourselves. And so it was almost by a kind of historical accident that due to criticism of the main method of the time, which was introspection. I mean, Barry's been referring to this a little bit about how far can we rely on our own judgments about what it is that we're experiencing. This general method was cast into suspicion, and the behaviorists took over and said, okay, now we can only really look at what people actually do in response to stimuli. So, but it was a kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater as well, because as well as criticizing the method, then of course the central topic became difficult to study. So I think over recent years, what's happened, I mean, I started as an undergraduate in the early 90s at Cambridge, and actually Tony Marcel there again was one of the few people talking about consciousness when I was there. It was still not really allowed to be studied. But one thing that's happened is we have access to these wonderful new brain imaging things. They don't give you an answer. Taken very literally, it's just the same as phrenology. You know, you can say, okay, let's look for where free will is in the brain, or where the experience of red is in the brain. It's not in a place, and one shouldn't be misled by just seeing hotspots light up. It's more complicated than that. Nonetheless, it's an invaluable tool for beginning to unravel what goes on while people are having different kinds of experience. It gives us a way of correlating what people are experiencing with what's going on in their brains. And correlations are not explanations, but they can incrementally grow towards becoming explanations as the kinds of things that we take as correlations gets more sophisticated. So the first start might be to say, okay, let's look for an area that lights up when we're conscious versus not conscious. Let's say there's plenty of experiments you can do where if you show a face to one eye and a house to the other, then your conscious experience will oscillate between a face and a house. And the subject can say what they're experiencing at any one time. The actual sensory information is the same. And then you can start to look at what parts of the brain correlate with the experience of a house versus face. And that gives you a first start. And then you might start to ask, well, what about how different regions connect together? How do the connections between different brain regions correlate with whether you're conscious or not? And that begins to be a little bit of an explanation. Because now, one of the facts about our phenomenal experience is that it's bound together. So we don't experience, when we look at an object, we don't experience its color and its shape separately. We experience it together as a unified object within a unified conscious scene. So there's the idea that the neural activity underpinning that should also be bound together somehow. So we can start to look at things like synchrony. And there was a lot of excitement about synchrony. But now, of course, we go one step further, because synchrony by itself might not explain everything. And indeed, there are lots of experimental cases, for example, in absence epilepsy, where people become completely unconscious. Their brains are hypersynchronized. There's too much synchrony going on, and they're not conscious. So we can get to yet more sophisticated concepts about how networks of brain regions interact. This is the kind of thing we're working on at Sussex, also people like Giulio Tononi in Wisconsin, trying to come up with mathematical ways of characterizing how systems could capture formal descriptions of what an experience is like, and then put them to the test using the new methods that we have. So that's probably a bit longer answer, but that would be my answer.
Barry, there's been a bit of a beating up of philosophy going on here. I'm going to encourage you to sort of come back from that fighting. Philosophers, as you say, have been onto this for a very, very long time, and the ideas change as evidence comes along. We don't think in the same way as Descartes used to about mind-body dualism. With this sort of technological advance that neuroscience is giving you about the brain, how does philosophy sort of take that into account and then come up with new ideas that push things on?
Well, I think it's interesting because one of the nice things about the rise of neuroscience, especially cognitive neuroscience that's looking at experience and looking at conscious states, is that it has systematically ignored what philosophers have said and the way they've categorized and described the problems in the past. That's incredibly refreshing because they're coming up with their own terms, their own distinctions, their own theoretical frameworks. And actually, it's quite liberating because philosophers have this idea of saying, we've thought about it very hard, and we've now understood certain things are conceptually impossible. It's conceptually impossible, said Wittgenstein, to experience a pain and not know whose pain it is. If I experience a pain, then I know it's mine. That's just conceptually required. But of course, Chris and others here have uncovered patients with right parietal damage who've got something called alien hand, where a patient might say, this arm doesn't belong to me. Whose arm is it, you might ask? They might say, well, it's yours to the doctor, or it's my husband's. Now, sometimes when they can feel sensations in the hand, if you can prick the hand with a pin, you can say, is there pain? And they say, yes. And you say, is it your pain? No. Whose pain is it? I don't know. So something that Wittgenstein thought couldn't even be thought is actually part of the world of patients with this kind of sad and disruptive pathology. So that's making us see that it's not enough for an experience to be yours, that you experience it. You also have to claim ownership of it. You have to say, it is my experience, not just there is experience. And Chris can enlighten us as well about people who have thoughts going through their minds, and Descartes tended to think that thoughts were what you identified as yourself. I think, therefore I am. But there are patients who, again, with certain kinds of neural damage, will say, I'm having thoughts, but they're not mine. Someone is putting thoughts into my head. Now, they're not hearing voices, very different. They're having thoughts and they're not theirs. Now, what that shows you is that, again, it's not enough just for thought to be taking place in a mind. There has to be such a thing as laying claim to it or having ownership of it. So the sense of ownership of your limbs, of your experiences, of your thoughts, is an extra dimension to going into what it is to being a self or to being a person or to being a conscious mind. And I think philosophers had not seen that. In just one small further example, in my own case, I mean, I work on taste and flavor, and the hard problem of taste would be, can science and can neuroscience or physics tell us exhaustively what it is to have the taste of a lemon or the taste of a very fine burgundy? No, alas. But and I always want to know, what is it like to taste these great wines? And I'll never know by reading anyone because they can't tell me. So nevertheless, you might say, well, there's the hard problem, so I shouldn't pay attention to neuroscience. On the contrary, because we now know that people's ordinary view of their own taste experience is completely faulty. They think they taste with the tongue. In fact, very little of what you get when you taste melon or mango or peach or parsley or mint comes from the tongue. It comes largely from smell, and it comes from the odors rising from the mouth to the nose and passing back out through the nose in olfaction. Now, the fact that what we're calling a taste is in fact a smell, and any aftertaste is an after smell, but is experienced as if in the mouth, shows us that our experience is misleading. So if you're going to understand how what we call tasting works, if you're going to understand what flavor is, you're going to have to know exactly how it gets concocted and constructed from smell, taste, touch, many other things. And the neuroscience of flavor perception is actually fascinating and enlightening.
In one sense also, until experiments showed otherwise, there was a sense that consciousness is something that either is off or on, and it's one level or nothing. Yeah. And clearly, that's not the case anymore.
There are philosophers who have said this in print. Colin McGinn, who very famous philosopher in this debate, who said consciousness is so difficult we can never explain it, can't be explained. Our brains are actually too limited to explain the problem of consciousness. He nevertheless tells us that consciousness is like a light. It's either on or off. But actually, the flickering of light and the dimming of light is much more accurate about what consciousness is. I mean, we know that consciousness, sometimes it sort of diminishes. That state between waking and dreaming, you're half awake, you're half aware, things are in and out of consciousness. Whether or not consciousness is on or off, and also, Anil talked about the fact that everything seems to come together. Well, there's an experience of everything being unified in consciousness, but again, some very nice work by Tony Marcel, who's featuring largely in this debate, should be here, I guess.
At some point.
working on the disunity of consciousness, the fact that actually if you test people and get their reactions to particular stimuli, and you make them react by speech or by gesture or by blinking, you will get sometimes two different answers. Answers will go in different directions. Consciousness may not be a single thing, even though it appears that way.
Chris, your work is involved in actually trying to find, not maybe uses for understanding this, but to try and work out through experiments a way of understanding consciousness. And would you say that the work you and colleagues have been doing shows that different states of consciousness, different amounts of consciousness and awarenesses are perhaps behind some of the psychiatric or psychological things that exist in the population?
Very difficult question. Certainly in the case that Barry was talking about with the alien arm, where the person says this is... No, let's put it another thing. We've talked mostly about sort of negative things, but you can actually get positive things. So one of the famous ones is the out-of-the-body experience, where patients and even other people experience their body floating up and looking down on them or something like that. It has recently been shown that this effect seems to be specifically related to a particular bit of the brain, so that people with epilepsy who actually have a focus in this bit of the brain so that they get abnormal activity here, when the normal activity occurs, then they have an out-of-the-body experience. And this seems to be a dissociation between different representations of the body, because we obviously we have different, which relates to the unity of consciousness that we've just been talking about. So you have a representation of where your body is in relation to you, where it is in relation to the room, and all sorts of other aspects, which critically have to be all linked together to give a unifying situation. Activity in this particular brain seems to disrupt this unity, and you start feeling your body and being in different places at the same time. Now, interestingly, it's interesting that after this was discovered, then people suddenly realized that they could create out-of-the-body experience in perfectly normal people like you and me, using essentially virtual reality. And the original version was the so-called rubber hand illusion, where you have your hand is here, but you can't see it, and there's a rubber hand here which you can see, and the psychologist strokes the rubber hand and the real hand simultaneously, and within 90 seconds or so, you suddenly feel that this rubber hand is my hand, and you forget about the real hand. And you can, if you then hit the rubber hand with a hammer, people get very upset and they flinch. And it's now been done for the whole body. So if you're wearing your virtual reality goggles and you're actually seeing a picture from a camera which is behind you, you can replace yourself sort of 2 meters ahead. So the whole, which in a sense what Barry was saying, our whole conscious experience is much more fragile than we realize. And this is maybe why philosophers have always been wrong, because they've relied on sitting in their armchairs and thinking about what it's like, and not realize how much they're being misled by this. And I would agree, this is why perhaps neuroscientists and philosophers get on so well together, because we're discovering all these new and impossible things. But I wanted to ask Barry, because he was saying, how can science ever possibly explain subjective experience? And I would have thought what it can do is it can explain how subjective experience is possible, in the same way that you might have quite a good scientific account of how it's possible to learn a language, but it doesn't tell you what language you actually learn. Couldn't you have an explanation of how subjective experience is possible? It doesn't need to tell you what the subjective experience actually is.
I think we would have left something out we wanted to know. I mean, it was interesting, to put it back the other way, you said, well, we can share our experience because we can tell each other about our experiences. But one of the infuriating things is just this thing that happens to some of us, and from time to time, I'm sure some people here, you go to the doctor and you say, I've got this pain that's in my side, and they say, what kind of pain is it? Is it burning? Is it itching? Is it sort of throbbing? You say, well, it's kind of like that. But and as you keep trying to explain, what you really want them to know is, it's like this. You really want them to experience it. And then you feel the doctor would say, okay, now I know what to give you. Now I know how to react. But you can't. There's always something that eludes the describer and something that eludes the person listening or even studying from the outside. And I would have thought, yes, you can say there is subjective experience going on, perhaps, but you won't have given a full and comprehensive explanation of that state until you know what it's like to be in that state, and maybe that's something that will just elude you.
But in your wine tasting example, essentially what you're saying, we may not have the right words to describe our experience to somebody else, but the whole beauty of wine tasting is that you together learn the vocabulary, and you get better and better at telling each other what it's like.
I think that's encouraging, and I hope that's true. And I think we have the illusion that's true. I think that's right. But look, I mean, the sense of sharing that I worry about is the fact that just as in wine lovers, but in young couples, when they're together and they're having a great time, and one looks into the other's eyes and says, "Did you feel it too?" The other will say, "Yes," but that's just false. They didn't. It's nice to say, but it's just false.
I was going to make a comment, but it's an inappropriate time to follow directly on from that. But getting back to where you were before, about the limits of describing subjective experiences and always leaving something out, I think that might conflate two things. So, I mean, one of the great virtues, I think, of philosophy is, of course, there's keeping us all honest and doing this an analytical, conceptual hygiene so we keep on track. The other thing is the phenomenological tradition in philosophy, which, of course, you're heavily involved in, giving us the better language to actually describe what it is we're trying to explain. So Husserl and Merleau-Ponty and people like that, I think, are underappreciated in this field. We always focus on Descartes and that side of it. But the neuroscientists among us need to have a better set of explanatory targets. What is it that we're trying to explain? What's the experience of time passing like? And I think we can get quite a long way with that. In fact, and the difficulty of verbally describing stuff isn't just limited to conscious experiences. I'd have difficulty giving an exhaustive verbal description of the English coastline, but I can still make measurements and begin to understand what it's like. And so the other worry is there still something left out, given that we can do as well as we can using language to describe something? There may well be something left out, but is that really a problem? Because the worry there is that we're expecting too much from an explanation. An explanation is not going to be an instantiation. We don't expect that a description or a scientific account of something that's not an experience should generate that experience. We don't expect a model of a hurricane to be windy, but somehow we still expect maybe a bit more from an explanation of consciousness, that it will tell us what it's like to taste the wine. And I wonder why we ask that much more.
I think I know why, and that's because we know there's more, because we experience it. I mean, when you talk about the coastline, it's true, you can't give an exhaustive description of the coastline, but you also can't know everything about the coastline. Whereas when you're talking about subjective experience, if you're trying to get me to talk about it and I'm trying to convey it to you, I know I'm leaving something out because I know there's still something there I can't get across, and I know with certainty it's there. Whether I know exactly what it's like myself is the thing that we should be worried about, because I think we're very misled. But look, here's the thought that Tom Nagel had, the philosopher Tom Nagel had, long before the hard problem became the fashionable phrase. When we think of other animals and we think, are they conscious? Well, maybe we'll never know, but we think if an animal is conscious, there's something it's like to be that animal. And that's the thing that we can't know, perhaps, by studying it in other different ways. We can know a lot about it, and Chris is right. I mean, the answer to Tom Nagel's question, what is it like to be a bat, is boring and myopic. But but that doesn't still capture what it's like for the bat. It doesn't get it all.
Well, we're looking at the bat's point of view from our much richer point of view, isn't it? That's why it's boring to the bat, where it's probably too intense what we experience if you do it the other way around. Now, look, let's not get bogged down in the subjective experience business for now. Let's ask the audience some questions and see if they're interested. If you want to ask more about the subjective experience, please do. Now, there are microphones going around, so please wait for the microphone before you start speaking, otherwise no one will be able to hear you. We'll go for someone at the front here, and then here as well. Then we'll go towards the back as well. Yeah.
I have a question directly related to the animal issue that you just brought up and the earlier issue about communication. Do you think consciousness, because you're talking about communicating, it has to do with sort of language or communication to be able to think of it in those terms? Or would there be consciousness without having a sort of, like a language type thing to think about it in? And how far back, like in evolutionary terms, like in social animals, say, how much is consciousness there versus not, and in animals that communicate with each other versus not, like how far back does this hypothetical zombie person go, in the evolutionary line?
I would say, I think human language is clearly very special and no other animal has it. But I think whatever the aspect of consciousness I'm talking about, which is this ability to think about other people's points of view, experiences and so on, came first. And it was because of that ability that language suddenly became something that was incredibly useful. And that was the pressure for language to evolve. So I think the language comes second. What we haven't really talked about is different levels of consciousness. So in a sense, what I'm talking about is something like self-consciousness, knowing what I know and being able to talk about it. And again, that may be particularly highly developed in humans. But I guess there's another kind of consciousness which is simply being aware without knowing that you're aware. And the nice example of this is an experiment by Jonathan Schuller where he did a real experiment, but the thought experiment would be that you're reading a very tedious book like Principles of Brain Imaging by Frakovia et al. And after about 5 minutes, you suddenly realize that you weren't actually reading the book anymore, you were thinking about what was going to happen in the evening. And that's, of course, interesting because you were obviously conscious when you were not reading the book, but you were not aware that you were not doing what you were supposed to be doing. So that's already a higher level of consciousness where you're thinking about what it is you're conscious of. And this brings in this very interesting idea of the refrigerator problem that you can only explore consciousness by asking people about it. So you never know when the light is still on when you close the fridge door.
There's a question here, and then we'll take some more. So I'll come back to you.
Maybe
if you don't
animals
mind.
have this lower level.
Is there anyone else sort of further back? Okay, great. Please.
This is a philosophical type of position, but I want to put it to all of you. And it may sound mystical and new agey, but I don't mean it that way. I wonder if you all are making some sort of fundamental error or short-sightedness akin to the heliocentric or geocentric position, that until we realize that the Earth is not the center of the universe, when we did or didn't, things fell into place, that the brain is necessary but not sufficient, that there's some shortcoming. Like the New Agey view that consciousness is out there like the ether and our brains are just receivers rather than transmitters. So is the problem hard because you're missing something essential akin to the geocentric, heliocentric shift?
Could be, but I'm not betting on that. I mean, when people tell me consciousness is out there and we're picking it up, that seems to me to be a popular view among people who are so stuck with the problem that they're looking in new places for an answer, and they say things like this. They say, well, look, physicists say the world is made of matter, but matter itself is very puzzling and very complicated, and when we look at the quantum level, it's very complicated. So maybe consciousness is sort of suffused through the world in this complicated way, but that's just replacing one mystery with two. So we've got complicated consciousness and we've got complicated matter. And I'm afraid that view attracts Nobel Prize winning scientists, physicists in particular in Cambridge, at the end of their days. They tend to say, I've been very clever and I've solved lots of problems, and there's this consciousness problem, and they just haven't had clever enough people to do it. So let me think about it. I don't think looking at more sort of surrounding puzzles about physical phenomena is going to get at it, because I do think there is something which, for all its mystery, seems very local and very rooted to a person and to a creature. And if we don't find something with the creature, I don't think we'll find the answer. Just to add quickly to the question here, sometimes I sit and think, sometimes I just sit. There can be consciousness without an awful lot going on in it. But remember that everything that happens in consciousness depends a lot on what's happening before and what will happen after. I mean, what goes on at a moment of consciousness depends on much that goes on outside it. And language is one of those things, cultures and other social relations. So an awful lot of the conscious experience cannot be got at by just looking at the moment. You're going to have to look at what infuses it and what structures it and what shapes it. And that's where I think we'll get into the wider world.
Okay, there's a question here, but Jason, if there's he's already got a microphone, but I saw some hands up here. Yeah, maybe if you can come up here. I'm coming to you guys as well.
Are we finding it difficult to define consciousness because it doesn't exist? I'll give you a proposition. Consciousness is simply an emerging property or function of extreme complexity. Now, you can give a dog a bad name and call that reductionism, but can you think of a good argument, a logical argument, why that proposition should not be true?
Well, my turn. Great. Thanks.
I want to go, but I want him to answer first.
I kind of half agree and half totally disagree with you. And I think it's a premise. If you're going to be interested in studying consciousness, you take it as a premise that it exists. Otherwise, there's nothing to actually do. And in fact, sometimes it doesn't exist. So if we didn't fall into a dreamless sleep every night, we may not have ever realized that consciousness was something that had a particular physical substrate. Now, when you say something like a proposition, it's just I think you said just as well, an emergent property of a very, very complex system, I think that's quite an interesting idea. The problem is, what exactly do you mean by complex? What exactly do you mean by emergent? How do these things actually start to connect the things that we can observe within the brain to properties of phenomenology? And in fact, one recent line of thought, and one of the things that got me interested in taking on this consciousness thing about 10, 12 years ago, was some work done by my old boss, Gerald Edelman, who was a Nobel laureate and then started working on consciousness, but I think did so in a sensible way. He wasn't a physicist, he was a biologist.
Immunologist. Yeah,
And immunologist. And he, with Tononi, started to think, okay, what is it about an experience? What's special about experience? One of the things that's special about experience is that it combines a vast amount of differentiated information. Every experience is one among a vast repertoire of possible experiences with unity, at least of some sort. There may be disunities as well. And how do we describe that kind of system where there's lots of independent things and some dependent things? And that turns out to be within the remit of complexity theory as it's studied in mathematics. So we can start to take some of these concepts, which on the face of it are equally vague and woolly as consciousness maybe, or complexity emergence, start to pin them down quantitatively, and start to think how you can build explanatory bridges from one to the other. And emergence is another one that we're looking at as well. How actually do we measure the degree of emergence in a system, and what's that got to do with the kinds of things that we experience? So in a sense, I do agree but I think we have to be very precise about it. It doesn't rule out, by any means, the standard correlational approach of looking for what goes on in the brain and how that relates to different sorts of experiences.
I was puzzled by your question because you told us maybe it doesn't exist and then you told us what it was. So, I mean, either you don't think there is anything, in which case we don't need an explanation, or you think it is something emerging at another level of complexity from already rather complex phenomena. You said, is there a logical argument against that? Well, you know, Aristotle said, don't ask the poet for a proof, don't ask the mathematician for a poem. I mean, you have to find the right tools for explanation. Now, when you've got a whole load of complex fibers firing in the brain, and then you talk about the complexity of the patterns and the dynamics of them, you've got more complexity, and then if you mathematize them, you can describe it, you can describe the dynamical processes mathematically. Still a little short of knowing what it's like to be you now, asking that question. Maybe there's nothing it's like to be you. Maybe you are a zombie. But I think not. I think there is something it's like to be you, and I think that's not going to fall out naturally of the complexity. But it's certainly true that if you didn't have this level of complexity going on, you probably couldn't ask the question you just asked.
Okay, now we have a question here, but I'd like to take a question from the back third of the audience. So if there's someone close to you, maybe you there? Okay, now here.
Thank you. My name is Charles Ross from the Brain Mind Forum. In studying the problem of the hard problem of experience, can we not learn something from the whole subject of learning? Because surely when we're born, we aren't conscious, or we're not conscious of very much.
Yeah.
And as we grow up, slowly we become conscious of more and more and more and more. So surely conscious is something we learn. And secondly, it was jolly hard work learning to drive. And I had to do that, I think we all had to do that, very consciously. When I drive home tonight thinking of what you've all been saying, I'll be doing it under what I think we normally call autopilot. So I wonder if we've got the terminology a little bit wrong between consciousness and unconsciousness, awake and asleep. Because if I'm on autopilot, I'm not exactly conscious, then hopefully I'm not asleep.
I think that's absolutely right, and that's why there are levels of consciousness. I mean, some people would say that when you're on autopilot, you automatize things, right? So you have very complicated techniques to learn in driving, you're consciously aware and attending all the time, but then eventually you automatize or routinize them, and you can do a lot of things without thinking about them. Now, how conscious are you? Conscious enough that you have to react very quickly when something grabs your attention. If you were completely out, you wouldn't see the lorry that hits you. But luckily, things impress themselves on you at certain times as you're driving home, and you react. So I do think that the ability to have your attention captured means there's at least a minimal level of monitoring, which is important. The learning thing is interesting. I have a friend who is a psychologist, now a professor of psychology, who claims he wasn't conscious till he was 14. Maybe not. I don't know what that was like. But so I think that's a terminological thing, because when people talk about consciousness not appearing until late, I think they mean the sorts of thing Chris is talking about, knowing what conscious state you're in, or even being able to reflect on it. You see, here's something philosophically we should concentrate on. Being in a conscious mental state is one thing. Knowing what mental state you're in is another. That requires a feat of phenomenological taxonomy to be able to correctly classify your state. Right now, am I feeling, is it anxiety or exhilaration? Don't know. Maybe it's sort of between. You can be in states where it's quite difficult to tell how you should classify them, but you know they're going on. So I think being in a mental state, one thing, thinking about, reflecting on, and classifying it as another, and that comes late. Surely that's something that's acquired.
There's a Russian psychologist called Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, something like that, I think is. And he studies this condition called flow, which is when we are engaged. Maybe taking your driving example to the extreme, we're engaged in an activity, and we're so engaged in it we lose all reflective contact with that activity. And one of my colleagues in America, when I was living there, used to claim exactly. He said, "I'm unconscious when I'm driving home," and obviously you think he doesn't really mean that. What he probably means is he's not reflectively aware of what he's doing, but he's not unconscious about any means. And now we can start to look at what the different things are that differentiate being reflectively aware of something and being in this state of flow. And there are very specific brain mechanisms and brain networks that if you like, are almost anti-correlated. So when you're very, very reflectively aware and looking very much into yourself and what your experience is like, then you're less in a state of flow. And there's a balance between what's happening inside the brain. So these things are empirically interrogatable, I think.
Okay, now, there is a question over here, I think. But I want to get a question from you guys up there. And I can't actually see anyone.
There's a hand.
So I can only see a sort of hand. So whoever's got the microphone, just pick someone up there and get ready. And Jason, do you mind picking someone from over here? So whoever's got a question over here, but let's go for you first.
One of the defining features of consciousness, it seems to me, is that it's meaningful on all sorts of levels. When cognitive science, approaches the study of consciousness, it usually does so through the kind of notion of information. And information has meaning, but it's not quite the same as meaning. So is there a way, I wonder, to get to, neurologically, scientifically, to questions about meaning, or is this the purvey of philosophy?
Well, information theory is becoming increasingly useful in neuroscience, that's right. And I think, as you're alluding to, information theory itself doesn't necessarily have any meaning. It's really about the reduction of uncertainty in a system. It's a very specific thing. And when Shannon developed his information theory, it's really about the capacity of a channel to carry something with a given level of uncertainty. The meaning only comes in when we, as observers, see what's being transmitted from one place to another and apply meaning to it. So there is a gap there. But on the other hand, one of the founding concepts really throughout cognitive science, psychology, and philosophy of mind is that of intentionality, so that our conscious experiences always seem to be about something, whether it's something to do with ourselves or something in the world. And this is certainly a core feature of what it seems like to have a conscious experiences. Now, I don't have a good answer to how one connects these two things together, how one might use concepts that derive from something like information theory to say why conscious experiences seem to be intentional. But they're certainly informative in the sense that the experiences that we have reduce an awful amount of uncertainty about the kinds of experiences we could have. So that carries a lot of meaning.
Just wanted my scientific colleagues to be on the spot for a minute or two, but you could be asking two questions, so let me just try either. One, by meaning, you could mean significant. So there are certain events that are significant for us, and it's quite hard to say what that is, but I think even in neuroscience you could have something to say about that, especially if you believe there's an emotional component to certain experiences. When you see the face of a familiar person, you can have an emotional response that's very much part of the recognition and engagement of them as a familiar and probably friendly face. And even people who then have damage to the fusiform face area and lose some of their ability to recognize faces can still have a skin conductance reaction when seeing a face. So significance might come from emotional staining or gilding of some experience. That might be part of significance. But I mean, dreaming has significance for us in the sense that, and Wittgenstein was very good about this, he said, in criticizing Freud, he said, Freud always wanted to explain why things turned up in our dreams, but what we actually want is to know how the dream ends. we feel there's a kind of significance there that's always just out of reach and that we're aiming for. And Wittgenstein wanted us not to lose sight of certain experiences, like the sense of wonder and fascination, which even if we could explain the skin conductance reaction, wouldn't quite capture why it's so significant. He's got this lovely example. He said, Wittgenstein talks about visiting a doctor, a family friend, and he was watching the two children playing in the garden, and they put a live fly in the head of a doll, bury it underground, and run away laughing. Why does that raise the hairs on the back of our neck? Now, he's right that that's kind of spooky, and he wanted to say, even if you knew everything that was going on in the body, you won't explain the kind of the wonder or the fascination, the awe of that. I think that's right. That's quite a good observation. The other thing you might mean is word meaning. So Anil is right that if we talk about intentionality, that's meant to be an easy problem of consciousness. We're meant to have theories about the causal contact between ourselves and certain objects, such that causal covariance, when I'm in a certain state and it's correlated with the presence of an object, that makes that state about the object. But there's another aspect to, say, learning a language, and that's hearing words with meaning. So just now, the words I'm using seem to get straight through to you, right into the mind, uninvited, to kind of affect you and upset you or move you or interest you or whatever, because they're immediately recognizable. But if I use a word you don't know, if I don't know, I'd say to people, do you know what the word pleached means? Some of you will say, no, it's just like a sound. So when you hear a word with meaning, again, Wittgenstein says it's as if meaning seems to be all there at once in the mind, as if the significance of it's completely there at the front of the mind. And that's very difficult. That phenomenology is difficult to explain, even if you know what the word is about. So maybe these are the things you mean by significance or meaning.
Can I just because you brought up the thing about not recognizing somebody's face but still having the emotional response, you can actually get the opposite syndrome called Capgras delusion, where the person says, my wife has been replaced by an imposter. And the explanation here is that your fusiform face area is working fine, so you can see this looks like your wife, but the system that brings you this emotional recognition bit has failed. So it looks just like my wife, but it can't be. It doesn't mean the same. It must be an imposter.
Lack of significance.
I'm hoping there's a question up there somewhere. Wherever you are.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
David Chen here. I'd like to just, it's slightly rambly, but in physics, you can measure temperature. Temperature is the vibration of molecules. If you go down another level, the molecules vibrate, but they also have an energy level due to the electrons around an atom. If you go down another level into quantum theory, each level of electron has an energy level. I wonder whether, by using an all-embracing term like consciousness, that we are not segregating different levels. And the reason why, and the question I want to ask is, most Buddhists believe only 3% of the world are conscious. Clearly, they're using consciousness in a different sense. But I know, I personally do meditate, and I know when I am in a meditation state, I appear or feel like being in a different level of consciousness. So the question is, are we using this term into an encompassing way, and should we really look at different levels, or maybe different words for different levels of consciousness, temperature versus quantum energy?
Well, there's a good point, which I wanted to raise earlier, actually. There are levels of consciousness, and this is almost a semi-defined thing now, and experiments to show that we exist in different levels. And maybe, Al, you could talk a bit about some of those experiments and the conditions that we sometimes have to examine.
Yeah, I think actually just leading on from that, the tradition of Buddhism is very interesting, and the Dalai Lama actually spoke at one of the main neuroscience meetings about 7 years ago to an audience of 30,000 neuroscientists in Washington, D.C. And he's engaged in a program in which very, very highly experienced meditators are taken into brain imaging centers precisely because they're having different kinds of experiences. So it's important to recognize, just as with things like out-of-body experiences, just as with people who have interesting and maybe disruptive psychiatric conditions, things like deep meditative states are phenomenally real for those people. And it's interesting to know what's going on. That is a different level, if you like, of consciousness. And now we can begin to sort of extend on from that with some maybe more systematic explanations in anesthesia gradually changing people's levels of consciousness under various different kinds of anesthetics. The question of what's the right level to look, whether you go right down into the electrons and the superstrings or whatever, is a very difficult question to answer. And I think, in all honesty, we're still struggling with what would be the right level. But for my money, it's going to be somewhere between neurons and lots of neurons.
Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, there are different aspects of level. I mean, I think this is a very interesting point. And I would agree entirely that it's somewhere between neurons and lots of neurons, but there's levels of consciousness in the sense that you can be highly awake and vigilant and probably have very narrow focus on the world, and you can be sleepy, which is a much wider focus on the world, and you can be asleep and have no focus on the world at all. So that's one aspect of level, and psychiatrists used to talk about something called clouding of consciousness, which is, again, an abnormal reduction of this level of consciousness. But the other level we just touched upon was you can be aware, and then you can be aware that you're aware. So should you call that meta-consciousness? And probably what we're talking about is the ability to be aware that we're aware that we're aware.
What about comas and persistent vegetative states? These are very different states of consciousness.
Well, that's an interesting question. I would have thought in locked-in syndrome, I mean, the key question is, when someone is in a coma, are they actually conscious but unable to communicate in any way? And that's a very important clinical problem which brain imaging and other techniques may be beginning to address. In locked-in syndrome, I would see this as that this is someone who is unable to move anything except, say, maybe an eye blink. And there's a famous case of someone who actually wrote a novel using this means of communication. So I would argue that this person their state of consciousness is just like ours would be in this position where we can't actually move. So I don't think that's actually a different kind of consciousness. And the interesting question for the clinician is can you discover that someone is fully conscious who is unable to respond in any way? And one solution to this was to try and, to present words and say this, and measure their brain activity and say this person the brain is responding to these words, therefore they must be conscious. But of course we know from studies of normal people that you can respond to words without being aware that you're seeing words. And in my opinion, the best results that have been obtained so far to cope with this problem is actually to say we're using the brain imaging not to ask the question, is there a marker of consciousness? We're using it to give the person a means of communicating. So they can't move their finger, but they can change the activity of their brain in a certain region. And this is basically the technique that's used. You say to the person, imagine you're playing tennis, and when you do this without any movement at all, you can see a characteristic sort of activity in the brain. And this can be measured. So you can then use that as a communication system and say, I'm going to ask you a series of questions. When the answer is yes, imagine that you're playing tennis. And when the answer is no, imagine something else. And I think there are now 2 cases in the world where this has actually worked. What is interesting to me is this is actually saying the only way we know someone is conscious is if they can communicate with us.
And these are people obviously in comas or persistent vegetative state.
Yeah.
Well, it's a good question. So this is the famous work by Adrian Owen and colleagues, where he's asking people to respond. But if you ask Adrian Owen, do you think the people in persistent vegetative state are in states of consciousness just like ours, except this is the only way they can communicate? He's inclined to say no, and therefore to mark a difference from the locked-in patient, and to say it may be more like someone who's hypnotized. Is your name John? Yes. Where you don't think of them as fully there, but they are able to answer yes or no questions. And that would be important to know there was something going on, but it leaves all the moral questions open. Is that enough of a level of consciousness for you to keep that person alive indefinitely? if that was what they had. I mean, I said to Adrian Owen, why don't you ask them if they're conscious? And he said, they'd think I was crazy. But I would like to ask them that. But nonetheless, he says quite rightly he doesn't ask that because he has to check whether their answer is intelligible, and he can only do that if he knows the answer so he can check whether the yes or no is correct.
Just quickly following on that, I think these experiments are very good. And when you get a positive response from them, that can be very meaningful. If you ask somebody to imagine playing tennis for 30 seconds and then you see the relevant part of the brain doing its stuff for 30 seconds, that's very strong evidence that at least they can engage in that voluntary imaginative activity. But of course, we're still relying on their ability to understand language in this case and to exercise volition. Both of these things may be quite disturbed in conditions like the vegetative state. Again, because it's likely to be a very different kind of consciousness from the locked-in or from our waking consciousness. So there's actually a very recent line of work which I think is promising, which is coming out of Stephen Lorish's group in Belgium, where you use these transcranial magnetic stimulation devices, which at some point will probably be made illegal. But what you do is you basically put a very, very strong and brief pulse of electromagnetic energy into a part of the brain and watch what happens next. And it's great, I've done it. And what you find is that for people in the waking state, if you bang them with a bit of TMS and then you record what goes on, you see a very differentiated pattern of activity. The TMS pulse wanders all around the cortex for quite a long time. This also happens when people are dreaming. It doesn't happen when you're under general anesthesia. It doesn't happen when you're in dreamless sleep. And people have been recently applying this to cases of vegetative states and noticing that for those patients where you saw a similarly kind of complex reverberation of the TMS pulse, those are the patients that go on to recover into some form of minimal consciousness or fully recover. And in this case, you don't know whether they were conscious at the time, but it's an incredibly valuable prognostic marker and one that doesn't rely on them being able to understand language or follow it. So that's another approach.
Well, let's have some more quick questions. There's one here, and we want to go for one at the back there, and then another one up there, but that side if possible. So why don't you go first?
Yeah, I was interested how in the course of the evening we've been talking, a lot of times things are coming up about other sorts of input. So we're talking a lot about brain imaging and the wonderful new techniques, but at the same time, against that, it's always coming up embodiment, is what happens at the other end, what happens to the other end of the nervous system. And what I'd like to ask the panel is, one of the things that I noticed on the bump for this talk was, can we solve the whole hard problem of consciousness with neuroscience? And I found myself thinking, what sort of techniques can they imagine for the future that would marry looking at the activity in the brain with also looking at motor activity? Because it seems to be so key. And there's only so much you can do static in a scanner. I've been in one, and it's not like real life.
I know.
I mean, I absolutely agree with you. These brain scanners are wonderful, but you're lying on your back, they're very loud, they're very noisy, you can't move, you see just a little thing in front of your eyes. It's incredibly limiting. And the role of the body in structuring our conscious experience, maybe being a necessary condition for it, I think has been overlooked. William James, when he was talking about consciousness, he talked about our experience of the body. It's always the same old body, always there all the time. But it's, of course, an essential component of our experience of being a self. So being a self is not just being able to recall what I did last week or last month. It's also about the experience of ownership of a particular body and how it moves in an environment and how it reacts to motor commands and motor signals. And we heard a little bit already from Chris about how this experience of body ownership, which seems so fundamental, can be distorted and manipulated by rubber hand delusions, by patients who experience disownership of body parts or even of their whole body, or false ownerships of other body parts and so on. So at Sussex as well, we're doing some work with Hugo Critchley where we're looking at how signals from deep within the body might underlie not only our experience of emotions, that's one thing that's clearly very important, our body is the ground for our experience of emotions, but also our experience of the outside world. Depending on when the heart beats, we will perceive the external world slightly differently. So I think there's a lot to be done in terms of bringing the body back into the heart of cognitive science. And technologically, what we need are the ability to combine brain imaging with being able to move freely around in different kinds of environments, and we're still lacking that.
Yes, I mean, EEG, which is another form of brain imaging, can be applied when you're moving around, and I just need to advertise that my friends in Denmark have apparently developed an app for the mobile phone which gives you real-time source reconstruction from 14 electrodes as you wander about.
Just so that we can ask as many questions and more questions, because there's only a few minutes left, why don't we get a few questions at once? So there was someone here, and hopefully there's someone up there as well. So why don't you go first, and then you ask, and then we'll get the panel to answer whatever they can.
Yeah, I just want to quickly say, just on what you were just talking about, consciousness being in various different degrees, that truly, really, the only true unconscious would be when you're dead, and everything else is somewhere in between, whether you're asleep or not. But moving on to that is really what's the key thing. I think it was whether consciousness can be explained or not. Is it actually hard, or is it an easy problem? Is it an easy way for me to describe how I look, or how I grew up, or how I developed DNA? Can I explain that to you? No, I can't. As an actual my DNA built up. I think if you look at consciousness in the same way as being a giant flowchart of decision making, it may be one day explainable in the same way as DNA is, in that it's a code, or it's a way of dealing with the environment around us and reacting to it.
Okay, let's have another point from up there.
On the same theme of levels of consciousness, you could say that it is not like anything to be a rook. It might be like, it might feel like something slightly more to be an ant or a chicken, and then maybe you're almost conscious, you could say, at a dolphin. Now, I feel fairly conscious, but can any of you answer my challenge? Is there anything that it's like to be more conscious than a human being? Is there a maximum level of consciousness, and what would it be like?
Okay, maximum level, and then was there something here? Yep.
Yeah, I once had a friend who told me that she thought she was weird because she thought all the time. She thought that other people didn't go around constantly thinking about things, a narrative in their head. And that made me, when you talked about things like disruptive thoughts, that's what came to mind, because I thought, well, we're unreliable witnesses when it comes to describing what's going on in our own heads. We only know what other people tell us when it comes to judging what's normal. So how do we draw that line between something that's part of just having a human consciousness, human mind, and things that are deviant, or things like having a split personality? How can we ever really tell the difference?
Okay, now I said there was going to be one more, but one final one. You've got one, Jason.
Yes.
Yeah, go for it.
I was just wondering, do we really need to understand consciousness? I mean, it obviously it brings up an interesting debate, but is there really any application of this research and this thinking?
Right. Okay. So I'm gonna pass from Chris to Anu. Take whichever ones you want from those last few. Chris, maybe the last one first.
I guess, well, understanding consciousness, we've mentioned one sort of practical application, which is to deal with people in comas and whether they're conscious or not. I guess one of the things that's emerging is that we're actually rather bad at knowing about our own conscious experiences. So if we understood it better, we might get better at introspection. And I would therefore believe also at communication, which would be a good thing. And maybe that's where the more consciousness question could emerge from. Though, of course, when I was a child of the 60s, so I read Huxley's Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell, where he was thinking that he believed at that time that you could expand consciousness by taking mescaline and things like this. Although the net result of this is that a lot of people just sat around saying how marvellous it was. So that's the nearest we've got so far to expanding consciousness. Yeah.
So the first question about building up a roadmap, there's definitely something right about the uniqueness of each person's consciousness. And it's not uncorrelated with their unique path through the world. Nobody else actually spatiotemporally goes through the world the way you did and is subject to some of the inputs you had. So you realize that a lot of what you have in consciousness depends on your encounters with the outside world. So we need a kind of inside-outside explanation, but just the spatiotemporal route's not enough, but that's definitely part of the story. when you were talking about other thoughts or other people's thinking and deviance and so on, I just wanted to stress something we haven't talked about, and that is the fact that we know an awful lot about other people's minds. We forget that when we talk about consciousness, because we can't experience other people's consciousness. But we know a lot about other people's minds, what they think, what they feel, what they like, what they don't like. We predict what they'll do or how they'll react. And we do that because we have something like a kind of theory of mind, and one of the great experts and exponents is Uta Frith, who's here. And we can use that without having access to other people's consciousness, but it's used in a very sophisticated way to tell the difference between what they tell us and what we think is going on. So I think there are many more things to understanding the mind than just what we're focusing on with consciousness. And lastly, more consciousness. Well, there is this nice passage in Kingsley Amis where he talks about a character who goes off to a nightclub and with his secretary and behaves very badly. And he comes home afterwards and he said, "I feel very bad." And then he thinks about feeling very bad, and he thinks, it's very good that I feel very bad. So I'm a rather nice fellow. And then he thinks, well, thinking I'm a rather nice fellow is not very nice, and so he feels very bad. And then he thinks, well, the fact he's recognized this, he feels very good. And he realizes this is a constant oscillating state. That eventually degrades where you can't get any more. So I think there are kind of limits to consciousness of consciousness.
I'll take a couple of them. I think in terms of why do we need to study it? Well, it's there, because it's there for me is the prime thing. It really is the center of our lives and our world. But there are more practical applications as well. I think we've talked a little bit about them, but I think, for example, and both Chris and Frith and Uta Frith have been seminal in connecting basic science of consciousness to psychiatric issues. And psychiatric issues are becoming ever more widespread and prevalent in society. And at the moment, most existing treatments of psychiatric disorders are about suppressing the symptoms that they provoke. And one of the things that a neuroscientific understanding of experiences can do is give us a mechanistic hold on what's going on. So Chris's work beautifully provides a hypothesis that positive hallucinations that you get in schizophrenia are due to abnormalities in how we predict the consequences of sensory input or of our own actions. And this goes back to Helmholtz, we mentioned right at the beginning, his unconscious inferences. There's something awry about that system, perhaps in schizophrenia. And if we can start to understand the mechanism by which psychiatric disorders are occurring and generating abnormal experiences, that provides a very different way to think about possible, much more targeted, much more specific interventions that could result in better treatments. And as people are living longer and we've all got to die of something in the end, but we're dying less of heart disease, less of cancer than we used to, there's going to be a huge burden on neurological disorders, not just psychiatric, but things like Alzheimer's and so on. These can also be thought of as disorders of experience in some way. So I think it's not just the few people who end up in comas and vegetative state. It's going to affect all of us, and we need to understand not just symptoms, but really the mechanisms of it. Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thank you for all your questions, and I'm really sorry to everyone who we didn't get to ask yours. The panel will be here for a few more minutes afterwards, so do pigeonhole them and ask them more questions if you like. And for now, can we just say thanks very much to Anil, to Barry, and to Chris.